1856, as I'm sure most of you know, the Crimean War was a conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, which quickly grew into a European war when France and Great Britain joined to support the Turkish cause. Officials in Russia quickly realized that their far-off North American colony was at risk of seizure by the British, and so they hatched a plan. In 1854, an agent for the Russian American Company, which oversaw the Russian colony, came up with the idea of executing a fictitious sale of Russian America to a group of San Francisco merchants. Before the scheme could be carried out, however, Great Britain agreed to exclude Russian America from the war, acting on its own fear that Russia might give it outright to the United States. Although this first exploration of an Alaska sale went nowhere, it did stimulate curiosity in the United States and raised the possibility that Russia might actually consider selling the territory in the future. The New York Herald, for example, urged the United States to buy Russian America as soon as possible and warned, for example, that delay will preclude the possibility of our acquiring it and will in all probability have the effect of aiding Great Britain in its promised conquest and adding further strength to a rival whose power is already but too formidable on this continent. All of this speculation ultimately led two officials in Washington, D.C., Secretary of State Marcy and Senator Gwynne, to approach the Russian minister to the United States, Edward de Stockel, about the possibility of an actual sale. At this time, however, the Russian government was not interested. Now, the defeat of Russia in the Crimean War changed all that. The war highlighted Russia's need for reform in a variety of areas, especially its military. But it also led some Russian officials to reevaluate Russia's imperial ambitions. One of these, for example, was Grand Duke Constantine, brother of Tsar Alexander II. He argued that Russia should sell its North American possessions, citing the declining value of the colony, the needs of the Russian treasury, and the threat of American expansion. In response to this, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Gorchakov, began to investigate Constantine's claims, and after consulting several people, concluded that a sale might eventually be possible, but not until the Russian American Company's charter expired in 1861. Over the next few years, there continued to be conversations about the idea of a sale. The Russian government increasingly recognized how vulnerable its remote colony was. One official argued that America's belief in manifest destiny would determine the future. He wrote, quote, "Anyone who has lived in the North American life cannot fail to understand instinctively that this principle is entering more and more into the blood of the people, and that new generations are sucking it in with their mother's milk." Stockel, the Russian minister to the United States, echoed this concern about Russian America's vulnerability, stating, quote, "Any maritime power with which we shall be at war could take them from us." Before these tentative probings could go anywhere, however, the Civil War erupted in the United States, putting all such conversations on the back burner. The Russian-American relationship did improve during this tumultuous period, however, laying the foundation for a perceived friendship that would last for several decades. While France and Great Britain contemplated meddling or otherwise interfering in the Civil War, Russia refused to get involved. And as most of you probably know, in 1863, Russia sent a fleet to the United States to visit, a gesture that many in the United States interpreted then and later as a sign of friendship. In fact, Russia likely had an ulterior motive in sending her fleet. Earlier that year, an uprising in the Polish section of the Russian Empire had occurred. Though Russia had successfully put down the rebellion, it feared retaliation by the British and French, who might try to trap Russia's fleet in its own waters. The journey of the Russian fleet to the United States was likely a strategic move to avoid this. But whatever Russia's real intent, perception is reality, and many Americans would remember the Russian visit with fondness and gratitude in years to come. When Tsar Alexander II's son, Grand Duke Alexis, came to visit in 1871 and 72, the visit of the Russian fleet would be cited again and again in welcome speeches and newspaper articles as proof of Russia's true friendship for the United States. Now, all of this background brings us to the story of the actual sale. In the fall of 1866, Edward de Stokel returned to Russia for a visit and was immediately approached by Grand Duke Constantine about whether the American government was still interested in buying Russian America. When Stokel confirmed that it was, Constantine and his supporters began to convince the Tsar to sell. In mid-December 1866, Alexander II authorized the sale, and Stokel returned to the United States with instructions to begin negotiations. Stokel arrived in New York in February of 1867 and reached out to Secretary of State William Seward. Seward had served at the side of Abraham Lincoln and had even been seriously injured during the same assassination plot that killed the president. Seward was known to be an ardent expansionist and had, in fact, mentioned the eventual acquisition of Russian America more than once. In 1860, for example, Seward had said in a speech in St. Paul, Minnesota, quote, "Standing here and looking far off into the Northwest, I see the Russian as he busily occupies himself in establishing seaports and towns and fortifications. And I can say, go on and build up your outposts all along the coast. They will yet become the outposts of my own country." Stokel and Seward met several times between March 11th and March 30th, discussing the price and other specifics of the treaty. There were several points to be negotiated. Stokel expected the United States to assume the obligations of the Russian American Company, but Seward said it would not. Seward did, however, want the warehouses and other buildings belonging to the company to be part of the deal. Stokel agreed, but asked that the purchase price be raised to $7 million. The two men also agreed that the United States would pay for the territory 10 months after the signing of the treaty. Now, during this time, Seward won the approval of President Andrew Johnson and his cabinet. But beyond those few men, no one else was aware of the discussions taking place. Once Seward and Stokel had drafted a treaty, Stokel cabled it to St. Petersburg to receive the Tsar's blessing. The Tsar approved the treaty, but had some requests of his own. He asked that the payment be made earlier and that the Russian-American company's contract to provide ice to San Francisco be honored. With the Tsar's approval, the men could now move quickly to finalize the treaty. On the evening of March 29, 1867, they called together their secretaries and clerks. Seward also summoned Charles Sumner to his home to fill him in on what was happening. Sumner was the chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and his support would be critical in the ultimate success of the treaty. Sumner took the news in stride, but did not commit his support and went home. In the early hours of March 30th, 1867, Seward and Stokel worked out the final details, including the agreement that the United States would pay $7.2 million as soon as the House of Representatives approved appropriation. Seward would not agree to the Tsar's request for an earlier payment, nor to honor the Russian-American company's existing obligations. As a consolation for these rejected requests, Seward added $200,000 to the final purchase price. So this is how the price went from $7 million to $7.2 million, which has always struck people as sort of an odd number. The treaty was written in 2 copies and signed and witnessed about 4 a.m. in the morning. Now, Popular history in the United States, at least, about the Alaska Purchase tells us that the American people were against the acquisition, mocking the idea as Seward's folly, Seward's icebox, or Wall Russia. This popular version of the story, however, is wrong. In general, the American public, or at least as much as we can gauge about American public opinion by looking at newspapers of the period, was either in favor of the purchase or neutral about it. Many papers praised the acquisition, emphasizing Russian America's abundance in furs, fish, and minerals. Many also recognized its usefulness in facilitating and increasing trade with Asia. Here are just a few of the positive comments that appear in the American press. They called it an amazing deal. They called it a very profitable deal, and so on and so forth. Now, there was also some opposition. The greatest opposition came from one newspaper, Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. But even that paper eventually came around to accept the idea. A few other papers had negative comments, but they were few compared to the more positive comments expressed by the press. Now, the other source of opposition came from, not surprisingly, politicians on Capitol Hill, whose views were tied up with personal and political animosities. Some in Washington were opposed to the idea of expansionism on principle. Others were concerned about security or financial reasons. Some pointed out that the money could be better spent in other ways, such as in assisting in the South's recovery after the Civil War. Still others thought Alaska was a bad investment, a barren wasteland of snow and ice. And of course, it was true that people knew very little about this territory at the time. Finally, there were some who opposed it simply because they hated its advocates, Seward and Johnson. There were also concerns and opposition on the international scene. As you all know, Europe in the 1860s was a rapidly changing landscape, fueled by nationalism in its various forms and the international rivalry that was usually a byproduct. As Otto von Bismarck pursued his goal of German unification, he launched Prussia into a brief but decisive war with Austria and came close to provoking war with France in 1867 over the future of Luxembourg. During this same period, Italy was engaged in its own process of unification and eagerly took advantage of the instability in Europe to gain territory from Austria, declaring Victor Emmanuel the first king of unified Italy. As Germany and Italy consolidated their holdings and power, Austria's path was in the opposite direction. Faced with defeat by Prussia and challenges from the Magyar population within its borders, the Habsburg government compromised in 1867 and created a dual monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the midst of this international turmoil, the sudden announcement that Russian America had been given to the United States elicited a variety of reactions across Europe. Several U.S. officials serving in Europe remarked that the news had taken everyone completely by surprise. William M. Murphy, who was U.S. consul in Frankfurt on Main, wrote that it was astonishing, quote, what deep and exciting impression the news of the purchase had produced among the different political circles of Europe. Cassius Clay, writing from St. Petersburg, he was our representative there, told Seward that had the Alaska negotiations not been kept secret, he felt certain that there would have been, quote, energetic protests and quote, possibly armed intervention to prevent it. So what were people afraid of? Well, many in Europe feared that the Alaska Purchase and the evolving Russian-American relationship that it foretold was a portent of bad things to come. Murphy reported that while the liberal press of Europe viewed the sale as a mutually beneficial agreement between the two countries, the conservative press felt, quote, very uneasy and vexed. In their eyes, the low selling price hinted that there would be other compensations, either actual assistance to Russia for the satisfaction of her ambitions on another scene of action, or passive support for territorial changes on European soil. There were also rumors that the Alaska deal included America's promise to back Russia up on its ambition to abolish the Black Sea Clause from the Treaty of Paris. This, by the way, would continue to be a fear for several years. And in 1870, when Russia eventually did renounce the Black Sea Clauses, the fear came to the fore again. The Austrian newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse, wrote on April 5th, 1867, for example, that we are told that the government of the United States has obligated itself in an agreement for the cession of Russian America in support of the Russian government in the Orient and using the American Navy if necessary. Politicians in Constantinople were also alarmed by the news of the Alaska Purchase for some of the same concerns expressed elsewhere. The Ottoman Empire feared that a Russian-American alliance would involve the United States taking Russia's side in the Eastern question. The official Ottoman publication, La Turquie, compared the announcement to a bomb bursting in the midst of very complicated situations charged with tempests. Turkish officials believed that such a relationship would operate to the serious detriment of Turkey. The French press also expressed concern. The newspaper Le Temps observed that the American acquisition would have particular significance for British America, stating, quote, "Only the English provinces now stand between the Americans and the realization of their proud program." But the paper also declared that the importance of the Alaska Purchase was, quote, "not limited to the New World." Even Karl Marx had something to say about the Alaska Purchase. He declared, quote, "From the economic side, this acquisition for the present is not worth a cent. But thanks to this, the Yankees will cut England off from the sea from one side and hasten the annexation of all British America to the United States. That's where the dog is buried," end quote. There was, of course, great concern in Great Britain and its North American colonies that the Alaska Purchase would facilitate or even encourage American annexation of sections of British North America. And there were annexation movements at the time, so this fear was not unrealistic. Now, it's important to realize that the legislative process for acquiring Alaska occurred in two steps. The first step was obtaining the Senate's approval of the treaty, and the second step was getting the permission from the House of Representatives for appropriation. So let's start with the first step, obtaining the Senate's approval of the treaty. The treaty was presented to the Senate at 10 a.m. on March 30th, 1867, only 6 hours after it was signed, and only 2 hours before the first session of the 40th Congress was set to adjourn at noon. Under these circumstances, it was considered necessary to call a special session of the Senate to be held over the next 3 weeks to consider the treaty. During this period, Seward was hard at work rallying support for his project. He held dinners at his house, and he recruited men of knowledge and reputation to write about their own experiences in Russian America and why it was a valuable acquisition. These testimonials were published in major newspapers across the country, and they shaped and influenced the national conversation about the potential of this far away and little known territory. It's in these articles that we see descriptions of the various assets of Alaska: fish, furs, minerals, natural beauty, and so on, from men who had actually traveled there. Meanwhile, the treaty was referred to the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, of which Charles Sumner was the chair. Sumner had neither clearly opposed nor supported the treaty when he was told about it the previous night, but he had asked Stoeckel the following morning to consider withdrawing it. So initially, it would indicate that he wasn't in favor of it. But whatever Sumner's initial feelings had been, when the Foreign Relations Committee met several days later, Sumner seemed to have warmed to the idea. He still had reservations, particularly about the rushed and secretive way the treaty had been negotiated, but he recognized its benefits. Others on the committee also had doubts, and they expressed these doubts and concerns, but ultimately, the Committee on Foreign Relations agreed to recommend approval of the treaty to the Senate as a whole. That meeting of the Senate as a whole occurred in mid-June, and in it, Sumner gave a speech of some 2 to 3 hours strongly advocating ratification. Though we do not have a transcript of his speech, it must have been persuasive because the following day, the Senate ratified the treaty. With the ratification complete, Seward and Stoeckel congratulated themselves on a job well done. Stoeckel, however, had found the American process frustrating and exhausting. He complained to the Russian foreign minister back in St. Petersburg, with some exaggeration, that, quote, it is necessary to confer with some hundreds of individuals, to know almost all of them, to give on one side and another explanations and information, to speak to each one and to talk his language to him. So it's interesting, Stoeckel was expressing this frustration from the perspective of someone who worked for the Tsar, where there were many fewer people who had to be considered in any decision. In the United States, it took a lot of persuasion and negotiation, and he found that very frustrating and tiresome. He wrote to a friend that the 25,000 silver rubles that he had received for executing the sale of Alaska was not sufficient for all of the work that was required. But Stoeckel had no idea of the challenges that the Alaska Treaty still faced. Now, before the second phase of the treaty process could take place, and the second phase, remember, is the approval of an appropriation bill by the House of Representatives, the United States took possession of Russian America. On October 18th, 1867, the Russian flag was lowered and the American flag was raised over Sitka, the city that had served as the capital of Russian America. George Foster Emmons, the commander of the ship that had transported the American commissioners to Alaska, described a small ceremony of about 300 people, Russian and American officials and local residents, the salute of gunfire, and a brief exchange of formalities. There were no fancy speeches, there were no parades. The only notable part of the ceremony was the lowering of the Russian flag, which became tangled and tore and had to be rescued by a Russian soldier who climbed the pole and ripped it free, dropping it down onto the bayonets of his fellow soldiers below. From this point forward, General Jefferson C. Davis, no relation to the former president of the Confederacy, took control of the region as commander of the military district of Alaska. Over the following weeks, Davis and several Russian officials sorted out other details of the transfer, such as which buildings in Sitka were public and which were private, which was not an easy question to answer since the Russian American company had been in the practice of housing its employees in company dwellings, which would then pass from generation to generation. Moreover, though many Russian inhabitants were returning to Russia, there was a significant number who were too old and wanted to stay, and those people needed to be provided for. Now, the final step in completing the purchase of Alaska entailed the passage of an appropriation bill to actually pay for the new territory. The House of Representatives possessed the power to approve or deny appropriations. But the manner in which the Alaska Treaty had been handled left the House in an awkward position. The treaty had been signed and ratified by both countries at the very end of a congressional session. And by the time the next session opened, Alaska had been officially transferred into the hands of the American government. The House's prerogative then had almost been eliminated by these actions. If the House did not approve appropriations now, it would potentially cause an international scandal and show the U.S. to be an unreliable partner in diplomatic negotiations. The matter was made worse by the tensions between President Johnson and Congress over his imperial style in implementing policies of Reconstruction, a clash that would ultimately lead to an impeachment trial in the spring of 1868. Finally, payment for Alaska was almost derailed by one other matter, the claim of an American businessman, Benjamin Perkins, against the Russian government for money lost during a defaulted business deal some 13 years earlier during the Crimean War. All of these complications then meant deliberations over the appropriation bill were heated, both in the House and in the American press. Debate began in the full body of the House on June 30th, 1868. Opponents called the appropriation bill foolish, insane, and wicked, and declared that Alaska was worthless. Supporters argued the opposite, though many of those who advocated payment for Alaska were still highly irritated by the usurpation of the House's powers. In the American press, there was almost universal support for appropriation, and a main source of support was the concern about America's international reputation. There were many conversations that criticized the way in which this matter had been handled, but the papers expressed the need for the United States to ratify or to pass an appropriations bill because the ship had already sailed, more or less, so to speak. In the end, the House passed the appropriation bill 113 to 43. 44 men abstained. What's interesting is that of the 43 men who opposed appropriation, 41 of them had supported Johnson's impeachment earlier that spring. So this gives you a very good idea of what some of the driving motivation may have been for the men who voted against appropriation. Finally, on July 27th, 1868, the bill appeared in its final form, and it stated that Congress approved the payment of $7.2 million for Alaska. The next day, July 28th, Seward sent a requisition to the Secretary of the Treasury, and 4 days later, Stoeckel received a Treasury draft for that amount. It had taken 16 months, but the Alaska deal was finally concluded. And while popular history has perpetuated the story about the Alaska purchase as Seward's folly, no one today believes that the purchase was a mistake. In fact, Alaska has proven to be an incredibly valuable acquisition for the United States, both for its natural resources and its spectacular beauty. And its future is often at the center of national and environmental debates. There are even people in Russia who would like to take it back, arguing that the sale was in fact a lease of some sort. Despite the inaccuracy of those claims, the idea of Russian reclaiming Alaska has taken hold with some Russians and encouraged speculation and humor in the United States. But there is no reason to believe, however, that the United States would willingly give up Alaska anytime soon. Thank you. Okay, so I have some questions to answer here. Put on my glasses so I can read these. Okay, let's see. So how did the locals react to the deal? Well, it's interesting. At the time, the locals were not given any consideration in all of this, as you probably know. Subsequent to that, many, many years later, when the rights of indigenous peoples began to be something that was considered, there were attempts to try and make amends for that. But at the time, no one really considered whether or not the locals should have a view in any of this. The Russians did have a problem in some cases with the local people after the Americans did have a problem with locals after they assumed control. at this point, the Russians had already been there for so long that the local people were used to dealing with foreigners. So the violence that was experienced under the Americans was not significantly worse than the kind of violence that had been encountered by the Russians. Let's see, what are some of the other questions here? Was $7.2 million a big sum at that time? It was actually, it was a significant amount of money, to be sure. I don't know what percentage of the U.S. budget or the GDP it was, or the gross domestic product was it. I don't have that number, but $7.2 million was a significant amount. It was enough that people certainly were worried about spending that amount on a piece of property that was largely perceived by the American public to be not terribly useful. But internationally, there was some speculation, or there were comments that the amount seemed remarkably low for the transfer of such a large piece of property. So it's sort of interesting. I think it all depended on who was paying for it, right? So the American people felt that there was a lot of money, particularly only a few years after the end of the Civil War. There were many comments about how this money could be better used. But internationally, it was more than once referred to as a low purchase price. And that's why some people thought that there must be some other secret deal that went into the mix. Let's see what other questions we have here. Is there any evidence that the Russians considered an alternative to the deal, such as selling the land to the British? I'm not aware that there were any other considerations such as this. I've run across no evidence of that in any of the primary sources that I've looked at. The only part that the British played in this was the concern that the British might be able to take Alaska. The British, I never found any evidence that the British approached the Russians asking to purchase Russian America. There was an assumption by many people that once the United States acquired Russian America, that they would probably start to acquire some of British North America. But aside from that connection, I've not run across anything in the primary literature or secondary literature that would indicate that Russia ever considered selling it to the British, or that the British ever approached Russia about this. Let's see. I see someone ask, is it true that Alaska was lost because of a card game? No, that's not true. That would be a good story, but no, that's not true. Let's see. Yeah, that sounds like a joke. Okay, so I see someone named Irene has asked, what did the United States do after this deal? How did they start to develop this territory? Initially, after we purchased Alaska, our development of Alaska was very slow for a number of years. It was the territory was a bit of a Wild West for a while. It was a difficult place to live, obviously, initially. So you tended to have, Christian missionaries and people who were explorers or opportunists, people who were looking to make money, to perhaps mine, or obviously eventually gold would be discovered. But before gold was discovered, people who were looking to get into the fisheries industry or mining, those kinds of things. So initially it was a sort of a spotty development. The U.S. government the federal government didn't take a lot of interest in investing in the area initially. And so there were several failed attempts at establishing local government. There were lots, you can read letters from people complaining about the lack of contact there, the slow mail service, and all these other sorts of things. It would take a number of years before the United States started to really invest more seriously in developing the territory. And then, of course, once people began to realize the actual value of the territory, once gold was discovered, then there was very little hesitancy in developing the area and investing more in the way of local administration and infrastructure. But initially, that investment on the federal level in infrastructure was pretty slow, and there were a lot of complaints about that from people who resided in the area. Let's see. Go back here. I skipped some key negotiators in the process. I think I've already answered that question. The price valuation process. Was the estimated value of natural resources included in the price? No, I don't think there was any attempt to try and actually estimate the value of natural resources, many of which at the time of the sale were actually not entirely known. But the Russian American company had and its investments there, its property, its business that it had established with others had a value, and so I'm sure that was the starting place for coming up with a price. But they didn't send anybody out there to sort of do any kind of assessment of the natural resources, if that's your question. Were there any attempts to reconsider the deal terms after the deal was signed? No, I'm unaware of any attempts to try and modify the deal after it was signed. The only thing that I know about is that because we could not conclude the deal entirely until Congress was back in session, which meant that the appropriations bill was much later than we had originally than the treaty called for. Because remember, the treaty called for us to start pay for Alaska only a few months after the signing of the treaty. The payment for Alaska actually came much later than the treaty had required. Several years later, when a new Russian minister came to the United States, someone named Konstantin Kadakazi, he actually attempted at one point to raise the question of whether or not the United States should pay interest on the sale price for the months that it had been paid late. But that question was quickly dropped. But aside from that, I'm unaware of any kind of attempts to change the deal. I addressed in the very end of my talk the rumors that somehow this was a lease or some kind of temporary arrangement with Russia. This comes up over and over again. Not only have I never found any genuine evidence of this, but I attended a conference a number of years ago in which someone, a Russian, addressed this as well. And he had done a legal evaluation of the documents, the treaty, and so on, and also concluded that that this was not a lease, it was not a loan or anything like that, that it was a sale, and the document itself says sale. So I think that's it's kind of a dead issue. Let's see some more questions. Okay. Let's see, something about my cat walking into the picture at some point. Yeah. At home, it's hard to keep the animals away when you're doing any kind of Zoom or Skype or anything else, right? Okay, was there a British ruling over Canada back at that time? Yes. So this is very interesting. So this 1867 is also the year that of Canadian Confederation, and while the sale of Alaska to the United States didn't create Canadian Confederation, because they happened pretty much simultaneously, or at least the first stage of Canadian Confederation, they are connected in the sense that already in 1866, 1867, there were annexation movements in British North America. There were people, especially on the sort of edges between the United States, on the border between the United States and British North America, who felt frustrated by the way in which the British Crown administered the colony there. They felt neglected. They felt that they weren't receiving enough support from the British government. And so there were calls for annexation, both by citizens living on the border and by even some United States politicians. And so certainly this agitation by some parties for the annexation by the United States of some of British North America encouraged Great Britain to pursue and push for Canadian Confederation. And the possibility of the United States obtaining Russian America was a concern as well. So the British were aware of this possibility. I didn't go into it in my talk, but of course at this time, Russia and the United States had a very nice relationship. They were considered to be friends, and internationally, other countries understood this. And both the United States and Russia had various reasons to feel distrustful of Great Britain. So their distrust of Great Britain actually sort of brought them together in that way. And Great Britain, of course, was keenly aware of this. And so Great Britain was fearful that any kind of deal between the United States and Russia would negatively affect Great Britain, not only on the European continent, but especially in British North America. So all these things are actually very much connected. Let's see, any other questions have popped up? Was it possible that Alaska would remain a Russian territory? I think that by the time that the sale occurred, there were people in the top levels of the Russian government, as I mentioned, the Tsar's brother being the most prominent figure, who simply recognized that it wasn't in Russia's best interest anymore to hold on to this colony. The colony was far away. It was difficult to defend. There was a concern that if Russia went to war, it would be it would be an easy point of attack for another country. Also, there were advocates within the top officials of the Russian government who felt that Russia should divert its attention and its energies to the east. And this was much more practical in many ways. And so I think that it was just a matter of time that Russia decided to let go of this territory, which simply wasn't working well at the time. And you know, the various circumstances which I mentioned earlier made 1867 a good moment for that transfer to take place. Let's see, are there any other questions? Someone asked if the Old Believer communities that exist in Alaska today were they already in place by the time of the purchase? I am not certain about whether you can trace that lineage all the way back to 1867. I do know that there are Russian communities, Old Believer communities in the United States, in Alaska who do go back very, very far. I'm not sure if they go all the way, if they can trace exactly all the way back to 1867. One thing that surprised me when I visited Sitka a number of years ago was how little Russian influence was visible there. There is a Russian Orthodox church there, but there's some symbols, you know, there. There's a totem pole when you arrive in Sitka that has a double-headed eagle on it. But I thought there would be a more obvious Russian presence in Sitka as the former capital of Russian America. To be honest, I thought there might be a Russian restaurant. There might be more Russian things there, and there really weren't, and that surprised me. And it was one of the reasons that I became interested in this project and decided to investigate the sale and to write this book, because I discovered that there was so little there. And Sitka is one of the stops on many, many cruise lines, which is how I got there. And so it surprised me that there wasn't a sort of a greater presence, but also a greater celebration of that connection between Russia and the United States and this very interesting story. It seemed that in Sitka there would be a lot more of this, if for no other reason than reasons of tourism. So that's sort of interesting. Those Russian influences they're not obvious in Sitka. Those Russian communities and the things that you might read about, they're not obvious when you arrive in Anchorage, Juneau, Sitka, the other major cities that people visit when they go to Alaska. You don't see it as much as you might think you would. Let's see if there are any other questions. Where the 2 signed copies are. I do not know exactly where those are on exhibition at the moment. It's easy to see really lovely copies on the internet, but I've not actually seen one in person. A couple of years ago, during the anniversary of the sale, the 150th anniversary of the sale, one of those copies I know had gone on display and was part of a traveling exhibition at some point, but I'm not sure exactly where those are at the moment. Any other questions for me? Well, if there are no other questions, I would just like to say thank you so much for listening. I think this is a fascinating topic, as I'm sure Maria said in the introduction. I've written a book on this, and there's more obviously in the book than I could talk about here face to face. So if you are interested, the book is called Seward's Folly: A New Look at the Alaska Purchase. I'm currently working on a new project. So I mentioned to you that the Russian minister who arrived in the United States after the purchase was named Konstantin Kadakazi, and he had raised the question of whether or not the United States should pay interest on the Alaska purchase. So I'm writing a book about him, because he turned out to be a very interesting figure as well. When he arrived in 1869, he started asking all sorts of questions and stirring up trouble in the United States, and he was a challenging figure, challenging diplomatic figure. And so that's the project that I'm working on at the moment. But part of what he dealt with was, again, claims related to the Alaska purchase. Okay, some more questions. The name of the book again is Seward's Folly: A New Look at the Alaska Purchase. And if you look me up on Amazon, you can find the various books that I've written on Russian-American relations. And then I see someone named Lisa ask me, have I ever been to Alaska myself? I have. That is what got me interested in this. When I arrived in Sitka, the former capital of Russian America, I went to a bookstore thinking I would purchase a book on the Alaska sale, because I thought, I really should know more about this. I'm a Russian historian. At the time, I was working on my book about the visit of Grand Duke Alexis to the United States. But I thought, I should know more about the Alaska purchase, and I couldn't find a book on it. And I looked in this bookstore and there was nothing there. And so when I got home from the trip, I started investigating and discovered that the last book on the Alaska purchase in English had been written in 1975. And so I decided that that would be my next research project. And so I wrote the book so that it would coincide with the anniversary in 2017, because it clearly, there needed to be a new book on it for Americans, so that when people went to Alaska, they would have something to read and they could learn more about the purchase. And it was a very, very interesting project. Any other questions? I think that's it. So I guess I will say goodbye. I hope all of you are well, and you stay well, and hopefully before too much longer, we can all leave our homes and get back to some kind of normal life. Thank you very much.